Hi, welcome to the Midtown Vineyard Podcast. We're so glad you've joined us online. For daily encouragement, events, service times, and more, check out our website and social media. And now, this week's message.
In John chapter 14, Jesus is having a conversation with his disciples, and he's trying to prepare them for something that had never entered their imaginations. They never saw it coming. He's trying to prepare them for the idea that he's not going to be with them for very much longer. And this hadn't even landed on their radars. And to ease their aching hearts, he draws from language, from speech that would have been memorized by many of the men standing in that group. Some of them who had been married before would have delivered these same words. They were famous for their draw from wedding language. He said, "In my Father's house," you know this, "are many rooms. If it were not so, would I tell you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I go prepare a place for you, certainly I'll come back to get you, that where I am, there you may also be." And then he throws in a line at the end of the sentence. He says, "You know the way to the place where I am going." And then the silence, the awkwardness, the dust settles from the bomb that just went off. And it probably felt like an eternity, but to me, I think it probably didn't last that long before Thomas interjects what all the rest of them are thinking. He says, "Lord, we don't even know where you're going. How can we know the way?" And this is the setup for the famous words that Jesus speaks in John 14:6. This is the background, the context of what's going on when he says, "Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life." Famous words that are central to the Gospel of John. Famous words that are fundamental, central to following Jesus at all. For Christians for centuries who have claimed the name of Christ, we've found so much value in these words, so much power in these words, understanding Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, especially the truth. We get that. We understand that trying to live out our faith in the middle of this world where there's so much falsehood all around us, so much distraction, so many lies all around us, this is so different. We need a North Star. We understand Jesus as the truth. So we need that to live among all the smoke and mirrors, to find our way back to Jesus and follow him through this world. Did you know this world has been purposely set up against you? We've talked about this before. The day and age that we live in now more than ever, we understand this world has been dominated by a person that the Bible calls the devil. Someone who has been allowed to roam down here for centuries, spreading his lies, spreading his misinformation, spreading all that hurt and death and destruction. He's not changed his strategy. In his most robust teaching on the devil in John chapter 8, Jesus, one of the things that he says about the devil, more than anything else he says about him, is the fact that he is a liar. He says 6 times in one verse, he's a liar. You're just like your father, the devil. He was a liar since the beginning. He's the father of lies. When he speaks, he uses his native tongue because he's a liar and the father of lies. There's no truth in him. It's as if Jesus wants you to know the devil is a liar. And he's been allowed to spread those lies down here for centuries, and we haven't changed. We just live in a land that's been populated by his lies. And so trying to follow Jesus in the middle of all those lies is like looking for a North Star. We understand Jesus as the truth. We need his help. We need his guidance now more than ever. In the media age that we live in, where so much is baited against you, where Silicon Valley is mining your every search, monitoring your every like, following algorithms that have been purposely set there to shape you, to tell you how to dress or who to vote for or what to feel. If the rumors are true, they're listening in on your calls, and some have called this surveillance capitalism, where everything is out there influencing you as this propaganda apparatus leading us off course. We need Jesus as the truth, don't we? We need something to come back to understand our North Star now more than ever. We live in a day and age that is forming us. Right? I don't know if you know that or not, but every click that you click, everything you look at is leaving an imprint inside of you. Psychology is beginning to come around to this idea. Some modern thinkers are saying that we essentially exist as computers that walk around with our keyboards out. If you want to think of yourself this way, you have a hard drive. Everything you experience comes in by way of your keyboard, by way of the five senses. Everything you see, smell, taste, touch, or hear comes in. They tap on those keyboards and it gets stuck in your hard drive and it's forming you. Every keystroke, everything that's being watched, everything that's leading you or changing you into, you are being formed. Make no mistake about it. The question is not, am I being formed? The question is, who or what am I being formed into? Following Jesus amidst this mirror maze is not formation. It's counterformation. You're going against the flow. You're trying to follow truth amidst lies. You're trying to make sure the enemy doesn't leave his imprint on you or shape you or malform you into something. But everything you experience is having an effect. As one scholar, Matthew Henry, says, the present time is seed time. Everything you experience is planting a seed inside of you. I love what Thomas Merton says. He says, every moment of every event of every man or woman's life plants something inside the soul. Everything. There's no third category. Paul says this in Galatians 6. You're either planting to the flesh or to the spirit. There is no third category. Everything you do plants a seed. We need, amidst all these lies, a source of truth, a North Star, someone we can follow out of here. Oh, we understand Jesus as the truth. And Jesus as the life, I think we understand this. It's a famous concept, one we've come around when he was having a conversation with a friend named Nicodemus under the cover of night. In John chapter 3, a famous dialogue that's recorded for us there by John. Nicodemus, he's been following God and he's curious about Jesus because he's got some compelling thoughts, but some seem a bit wacky against the Jewish context. And so Nicodemus meets with him in secret to find out more. And there, under the cloak of darkness, Jesus says to him those famous words that Tim Tebow made famous on his cheek. For God so loved the world, John 3:16. That he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have, circle, underline, highlight, everlasting life. We understand Jesus as life. This is a common motif found all throughout church history, understanding that there's somewhere we can go now where we don't have to go where we were destined to go. We understand that life component. I would argue that sometimes we underemphasize the eternal part. We've made it only about there and then, and we forget it's available here and now too. You can have that life here and now too. We understand Jesus as the life, but Jesus as the way? Because remember, that's what he said. In John 14:6, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Do we understand him as the way? What I think we often neglect or underemphasize is that Jesus, in his way of living, is offering us or showing us or modeling for us a new kind of life, a new way to live. It's the Greek word hados, which means a traveled way, a road, a way. It's translated really well there. Metaphorically, it means a course of conduct, a way of thinking or feeling or deciding. It's a new way of living. The biblical word for how we live now, not just used here by John in John 14:6, but also used elsewhere in the New Testament, especially by men like Paul. When Latin became the lingua franca of the Jesus followers in the empire around the 3rd century, the translation of this word hados, which is way or conduct or passage, it became the Latin word regula, which is a little tricky to translate into English, but essentially means a straight piece of wood. It gets connected later to English words like regulate or regulation or even ruler. This is not proven, but most Greek scholars believe with very strong evidence that regula is the word used in Latin for a trellis, like you would find in a winery in the Mediterranean. And this, of course, is based on the teaching of spiritual formation Jesus has in John chapter 15, one of my favorite teachings that we'll cover in coming weeks. And a very well-known word picture of a vine and branches. So when Jesus teaches about a new way to live, a new kind of life, he doesn't give a four-point lecture with a bullet format. Instead, he gives us a word picture from the agrarian world of a winery. Vines and branches and soil. The early Christians picked up on this word picture and go, hey, wait, you don't see vines growing wild on the ground and producing very much fruit. If they produce any, it's very small, right? You see vines grow and flourish and thrive when they're set upon a support system, a trellis, where there's a regula, a straight piece of wood built beneath it. It picks the vines up off the ground, away from disease and predators, lifts them towards the sun, and indexes its growth in the desired direction. Early Christians picked this up and thought in the same way, if we're going to abide in God, we need a trellis system. We need a regula, a new order, a new trellis, a support, a way, a hodos for how to live that is built upon this new way of life that Jesus offers. How do we understand living a new way? A trellis system for how we live, unless we examine the way that Jesus lived. He's the way. And to do this as a church, in 2024, one of the things we've been praying about and are launching into today is a study of the Gospel of John. I think in order to understand Jesus' new way of living, we have to study his life. And one of the best ways to study his life is to settle into a gospel. And prayerfully, we've landed at the Gospel of John. If you want, you can open up right now to John chapter 1. A lot of you have that stare at me right now where like at some point he's going to say where to turn. Like I've been waiting so long. It's John 1. We're going to study the Gospel of John. While you turn there, I want to set it up for you a little bit. Many of you know, if you're new to Christianity, I'll explain a little bit. There are four primary biographies of Jesus' life in the immediate wake of the Jesus event. The birth, the life, the death, the resurrection of Christ, and the spread of this new movement that's mostly cataloged in the book of Acts. Four men rose up to pen biographies about this Jesus, this figurehead who so influenced and inspired their lives. And the goal of these four men, I've heard it said that the four Gospels are all, if you want to jot this down, passion narratives with extended introductions. It's a great way to think about this. Passion meaning suffering, the week of the Good Friday event, the trial, the torture, the execution of Jesus. The goal of the gospel writers is to tell you about that. To tell you about his death on the cross, more to tell you about his resurrection. But in order to tell you about the death and resurrection, they got to tell you the story before that one, and then they got to tell you the story before that one, and then they got to tell you. And so pretty much they all go, you know what, I'm just going to start at the beginning, right? Often like how we tell stories. The gospel accounts, the gospel writers are all passion narratives with extended introductions. Their goal is to tell you about resurrection. This thing that they saw with their own eyes in many cases, a life that had been extinguished, that came back to life and changed everything. They want to tell you about that. And in order for resurrection to make sense, they got to tell you about Good Friday. They got to tell you about the execution. In order for that to make sense, they got to tell you about Holy Thursday. In order for Thursday to make sense, they're going to have to tell you about Palm Sunday. And then they all kind of go, you know what? Let's just start at the beginning. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all do this. That's what these biographers do. Mark seems to have written first. He was in a hurry to get his gospel down. If you read his gospel, by the end of it, you will be out of breath. It feels like he's in a panicked hurry as he writes, but he wants to get it down. He's the first to pen this biography. Then comes Matthew. Then comes Luke. Each of these men likely consulting each other's works when they're writing theirs. And because they're using each other's works as sort of guideposts, as references, when to tell what story, these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all look alike. For this reason, you'll hear them referred to as synoptic, which is a really pretentious way of saying they look alike. That's all that it is. It's a big word, but it's pretty easy to break down. Syn, like from synonym, S-Y-N, means same. Optic means looks. They look the same. That's literally what that word means. Someone put that together to justify seminary. The focus of these men is to tell you what Jesus did and what Jesus said. Like to tell, how many people would have walked up to these guys going, can you tell us what Jesus said? Can you tell us what Jesus did? Tell us about the miracles. Tell us about the teachings. Tell us what he did. And then John comes along, knowing that these men have already written. They've answered the what. He's consulted their guides. And John has lived the longest. This is extraordinary. We'll find out in this gospel as we study John that a rumor went out among the disciples that John would never die. And John is quick to say in his gospel, he's like, y'all, that was just a rumor. Like there's nothing confirming that. And then we find like at the end of John's life, all the other guys are dead. And John's like, maybe it wasn't just a rumor. Like maybe that was true. Oh, they tried to kill John. They tried and he just wouldn't die. He had to watch all of his other friends die. He had to watch his older brother James die. And he lived long enough to see all of that. Likely, some theologians think he might have been as young as 11 or 12 or 13 when he began following Jesus, when he began that counter formation under his tutelage, walking with Jesus for that long. And Jesus lives and dies and is resurrected and ascends into heaven. And John has all this time to look back on. All the other guys die. Oh, they tried to kill John. In a very Dr. Evil scenario, they hold him above a pot of boiling water, according to church history, and they go, you got to knock it off about Jesus or we're going to drop you in this pot. And John goes, well, I guess you're going to have to drop me in the pot because I can't stop talking about Jesus. And according to church history, they drop him in that pot of boiling oil. They leave him down in there for a second and fish him back out. And when they do, John's just, I guess the rumor was true. This is awkward because what do you do with the guy who just won't die? You exile him to an island called Patmos, which is where John did a lot of his writing, because he had nothing but time on his hands and nothing but perspective to look back on. All those years with Jesus. And he decides with all that time on his hands, he's read the other accounts. He's seen what Matthew's produced. He's seen what Mark has produced. He's read what Luke has produced. And John sits down and he thinks, what do people need to know? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they've already answered the what Jesus did, what Jesus taught. This has been talked about ad infinitum. Can you imagine John as an old man? How many times over the years the scores of people that would come up to him saying, tell us about Jesus. What did he do? What did he teach? Can you tell us about Jesus? And John as an old man saying, you've already got the other guys. You've got the what? You've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What I want to tell you is who Jesus was. They covered what he did. They covered what he said. I want to tell you who Jesus was. I think it took him a little while to put it together. I think he walked with Jesus those 3 years of counter formation under his discipleship, under his apprenticeship. He knew he came in contact with someone divine, but he didn't quite know how to make sense of that. And all those years of reflecting on that time spent with Jesus, I think he began to make sense of who this was that he got to hang out with. And he sits down to write his gospel. He pulls out a piece of paper and he gets a pen and he starts the famous words, in the beginning. Famous words that start the Bible, famous words too that start the Gospel of John. And this isn't an accident. He's not borrowing from Moses and hoping you don't find out about his plagiarism. He's doing something very intentional here. In the beginning. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they would start with Bethlehem. They would start with a manger. They would start with shepherds and stars, and John goes, you've got that version, but what you need to understand is that I'm going all the way back to the beginning. Because if your Jesus starts at Bethlehem, your Jesus is too small. He stands outside of time. In the beginning, before anything was, he was there. I know, it's weird, right? It would take the church 400 years to figure this out. Under a famous council, John was there already on the island of Patmos. He goes, you guys flush it out. In the beginning was the Word. Isn't that beautiful? The logos, a Greek word that philosophers used as this understanding they had for their explanation of the power that puts sense into the universe. The power that made order amidst all the chaos, a power that set the world into perfect order and kept it moving in perfect order. They had a worldview that said something did that, and we call it the logos. This logos was the ultimate reason that controlled all things. Before this word, Genesis says that what existed was formless and void. You remember that part of Genesis 1's narrative. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was, and in the Hebrew, it's so fun to say, tohu vavohu. Let me hear you say that. Tohu vavohu. Isn't that good? Formless and void. It was chaos. The Hebrew word picture here is no order, no motion, no sense in the chaos. And then someone steps into that and gives it order. Genesis says it was God. The Greeks say it was the Logos. John goes, yep, both. God and the Logos. His name is Jesus. John wants to tell you his story. But in order to tell you his story, in order to tell you about his resurrection, he's got to tell you about Calvary. To tell you about Calvary, he's going to tell you about his life. To tell you about his life, he goes, I might as well just start at the beginning. In the beginning. Oh, yours starts with Bethlehem? If that's where your Jesus starts, he's too small. Let me tell you who that actually is. Glad the other guys caught the Bethlehem stuff. I want you to know what I've sat with is he was there. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's a great start to a book. He was in the beginning, verse 2, with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that has been made. So the Word created all things that were created. Therefore, he himself is not created. That's important to know. Some would teach that over the years. Jesus is not created. As the Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians 1:16, it says, for in him all things were created. Jesus is the creative agent. Things in heaven and on earth, I love this language, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And Jesus was present at creation. Jesus stepped into the tohu vavohu. It says God created. John 1 and Colossians 1 say Jesus was there too. Therefore, this Jesus, this Logos, and this God the Father are somehow mysteriously one, which means he's not just a good teacher. As the modern view would suggest, as sophisticated people seem to suggest in the secular age that he was just a rabbi or a good teacher, they seem to have that respect for him. And it's like, yeah, I'm thankful for that, but he's so much more. John says he was God. In him, verse 3, was life. So this word, this logos, is the source of all life. Not only biological life, which is important, but the very principle of life. The ancient Greek word translated here, life, is zoe, which is like the life principle. Anything that contains life. Not bios, which is biological life, zoe. Any type of life. In him was life, and the life was the light of all men. So you remember in the Genesis account, there's darkness, there's tohu vavohu, and someone steps into that and says, let there be light. John is drawing on that very specifically. In Acts 17, the Apostle Paul describes that at the beginning of time, people lived in relationship with God. We lived in union with him. But because of sin, God had to kind of leave us to our own devices. And it's as if, in Paul's language in Acts 17, the lights were turned off. We were left blind to grope our way, as Paul says, back to God. John would say that Jesus is God turning the lights back on. Let me show you let me show you God. You want to know what God is like? Look at Jesus. Before Jesus, spiritually, you were blind. You were in darkness. The true light, which enlightens everyone, verse 9, was coming into the world. This is as close as John will get to a Christmas narrative. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. So God's coming into the world. Verse 10, he's in the world and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him, which is a strange idea. God came to the same world he created in the person of Jesus, but his creation, his creatures that bear his image didn't even recognize him. This is how far we had fallen, how spiritually dead we were. He came to his own, verse 11, and his own people did not receive him. But, and that's an important but to all who did receive him, maybe this is you, but to all who did receive him, who believed, circle, underline, highlight, in his name, he gave the right, oh, this is so beautiful, to become children of God. Though some bucked at his revelation, others received him. Though some rejected him, others accepted him and thereby became his children. They became children through a new birth, John says, being born of God. The end of this story is not the tragedy of rejection, but the celebration, the grace of acceptance. This idea of receiving Jesus, language that we use that you've likely heard before, the idea of receiving Jesus is biblical. We need to embrace and receive him to ourselves. As many as received him is just another way of John saying those who believe in his name, which is other language that he uses. You can sometimes get a pretty good idea of what a work in the New Testament is about by studying the key words in that work. Sometimes I like to do this. In John's gospel, the name Jesus, which would make sense, it should be in there a lot if it's a biography of him, appears 275 times. You're like, that makes sense, which we'd expect. The name God appears 175 times, which we'd also expect. The word believe appears 98 times. In 21 chapters, 98 times. The word truth, 52 times. The word life, 48 times in 21 chapters. Significant to our discussion this morning is this word believe. It's significant to John because belief for John is not mental assent or agreement with principles. Belief to John is trusting God enough to do what he says. Trusting God enough, and sometimes that emphasis is on the enough, isn't it? Trusting God enough to do what he says. Faith to John here is described as receiving Jesus, which I think is beautiful. Something that C.H. Spurgeon said that I thought was beautiful too and wanted to capture and share with you. He says, receiving Jesus is the empty hand placed under the flowing stream. Isn't that good? The penniless hand held out for heavenly alms. It's another great turn of phrase. By trusting God enough to do what he says in the person of Jesus, we are placing our empty cups beneath his flowing stream, holding out our penniless hands. And by doing this, what John says, he gives us the right to become children of God. God. The children of God. We were born, verse 13, not of blood or a will of the flesh or the will of man. We've been born of God. Like being reborn in this way requires a rebirth. It's a new birth. That's something that brings change to our lives. As one scholar says, a person is like a watch which has a new mainspring. Some of you watch lovers will like that language. Not a mere face and hands that are repaired, but a new inward machinery with freshly adjusted works, which act to a different time and tune. And whereas he went wrong before, he now goes right because he is right within. John continues in verse 14, and this is maybe my favorite. I get more passionate as we go, which was dangerous in the first service, but I've got it together right now. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Isn't that beautiful? The Greeks generally had a view of the gods that was too low. They essentially saw a god like Zeus and Hermes. These were supermen. These were human beings who were really rad and became super. They could fly, and there's a really low view of the gods. And then the Jews generally had a view of God that was so high, they would have to work to get to his level. And the idea described here by John brings balance. Ancient Jews had a hard time accepting that this great God, as revealed in the Old Testament, would ever take on human form. And John told the Jewish thinkers, the Word became flesh. I know that's hard to understand, but isn't it beautiful? I love how Eugene Peterson translates this in the Message version of the Bible. He says, the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. He moved into our worlds, and we have seen his glory. Glory as the only Son from the Father. This is the part where I get a little emotional. Full of grace and truth. John's an old man here. And he's still reeling from the 3 years he spent with Jesus as a teenager. You can hear it here. He's like, he can't get over it. We've seen his glory. If you read 1 John chapter 1, the first chapter of that is essentially one rambling, long, run-on sentence in Greek. He's not gotten over what he experienced as a child. We've seen his glory. Like, that's who we were hanging out with. We knew something was special. We knew life would never be the same. We spent the rest of our existences here longing and pining to be with him again. And for some reason, I've gotten trapped down here the longest. Is it punishment? I want to be with him. We saw that glory. Glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. He developed a way of trying to explain what that glory was like. Like he workshopped. This is years of trying to put together what he's seen, and that's what, full of grace and truth. Right? We all do this. We come up with answers to questions. Right. I've come up with so in the past week or two, I've been approached by people and we've all done this as we return to school or jobs or just life in general. People will go, how was your holidays? Right. And we all are like, well, I don't know where to start. Like Christmas morning, my daughter was vomiting. Like it was a whole, you guys are like, you stay up there. Like we traded around illness all break. Right. And I'm like, I don't know how to answer this question. They probably don't want to know that. So what I came up with as an answer, I would go, we had a lot of illness in our home, so we spent a lot of time at home, but it was good because we got to rest. How was yours? I did it just a minute ago, like in the lobby, like 20 minutes, well, maybe not 20. We develop language for answering questions that are difficult to answer. That took me a week to come up with. That wasn't a joke. John's had decades to reflect on describing what it was like to hang out with Jesus. Decades. And what he comes up with here, just that short phrase, full of grace and truth. It's hard to describe in English because it's written in Greek. I think it's easy to think of a glass of water that's 50% one thing, 50% another. 50% grace, 50% truth. Maybe 60% grace, 40% truth. We love a Jesus that's 90% grace, 10% truth. What John's describing here, as much a contradiction as it is, he says he was 100% grace, 100% truth. That's the best I can do. It's like, see, he's 100% grace, 100% truth. And we see this illustrated in this gospel. We see this personified. We see a Jesus who recognizes us in our messes. I think this is the thought that I just can't. I was up early this morning trying to describe this to my wife. In John chapter 8, Jesus sees a woman who's been caught in the act of adultery. It's about as close to that line as I want to get. There are men who find her in the act of adultery. Imagine how exposed you would feel. These men who are so eager to punish her, they pull her out of that setting. And they plop her down in front of a gathering of folks, all there to look down on her and judge her, so exposed. And they all pick up rocks because the law says they can stone her to death. You remember this story. And they turn to Jesus and they say, "What do you say, Rabbi?" It's a trick question. And Jesus, without even looking up, he goes, "Whichever of you hasn't sinned can go first." And they drop their rocks and walk away. And Jesus walks up to this woman, so broken, so frail, so exposed, so scared. And he steps into her mess and gets eye level with her. Do you remember what he says? Daughter? He gives her back her dignity. Daughter, it's the first word. Who now condemns you? She looks, probably the first time she's picked her head up in that whole scene. No one, sir. They're all gone. And what he says next may be the biggest contradiction in the whole Bible. He says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." He's identifying that it's sin. That isn't lost on him. He's not missed that. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. It's a Jesus who meets us in the muck and mire and quicksand and mud of our lives and says, "This looks pretty gross down here. I love you. Seems like this is killing you. You want to get out of here? Seems like you should want to leave this behind. Who now condemns you? Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." It looks like this lifestyle hurts. It looks like we should try to leave this behind. Yeah, it's the people that Jesus meets like this over and over in this gospel. It's so compelling. It's what I think it caused Jesus to have such a large gathering. As you see, the contradiction through the gospel of John is as he walks along and treats people with this dignity, with this grace, and with this truth, that people are compelled to that. They begin following him. It's the religious leaders who can't seem to get a following. And I think it's still true today, isn't it? Great luminaries and thinkers and philosophers and teachers and artists over the years have all unanimously said they find Jesus compelling. There's something about him that people are drawn to. The religion that's kind of blossomed in his name, maybe they find that a bit confusing, but when we get back to just Jesus and the purity of Jesus, people find that compelling, and we see that in this gospel. And so as a church, that's kind of what I think, we've been praying. We want to get back to this as a church this year. in 2024. And so something prayerfully that we've considered, prayerfully that we're approaching, is the idea of walking with Jesus through the Gospel of John, walking the way with Jesus through the Gospel of John to Easter. Literally Easter on the calendar and Easter in the book. We want to walk with Jesus to Easter. That was the goal of John writing. He wanted to tell you about Easter. All the gospel writers did. They want to tell you about Easter. But to get you there, they got to tell you the way. And we're going to walk with Jesus on the way to Easter. And we're thinking too, prayerfully, that you may know folks, you may be able to picture folks who are compelled towards Jesus, who find him compelling. I keep using that word, but just something about him. It's the religion part where they get a little confused, but the Jesus part, man, they seem really affirming of that. Like there's someone there when we're talking about Jesus. Maybe there's folks like that that you can picture, that you can think of, that you want to invite into the journey too. The truth is, here in the Bible Belt in the South, everybody's going to spend Easter somewhere. That's generally the truth, generally the principle. We all invite people to Easter. So everyone, you see the pictures on social media, we're all going to spend Easter somewhere. What I'm asking, what I'm praying is that you might consider inviting somebody into the story the same way we see in the gospel. This movement of Jesus spread because as Jesus went along, he would invite people who were stuck in their devices. He would invite them to follow him, and then they would invite other people, like, you should come check this out. Like, it was very organic as they moved towards Easter. And I'm thinking the same could be true here. Who are the folks that you know who may be invited into this new way of studying the life of Jesus, walking with him to Easter, learning from him, learning the Hodos, learning to live like Jesus lived, this alternate way of living? It occurs to me that with each year, with each new slate, maybe this Easter would be the time to invite them on the journey too. So, in a moment we're going to close. I'm going to pray. And what I would ask is that in this time of closing, maybe take a moment as we prepare our hearts for this study to walk with Jesus on the way, to walk with him to Easter, to walk with him to the cross. I think just taking a moment to catalog where our hearts are, to commit to this journey, and to pray wherever you find yourself. And if in that searching, in that inventory that you take, if there are things there that you'd like to leave here at the altar, maybe prayers you've been praying, things you've been carrying. We've got these kneelers up here. We point them out every week. It's a great place to come and just lay your requests before God, to leave them there. We've got prayer candles up here at the front. Some folks find it helpful to literally light a candle while they're praying for somebody. It just provides movement, something tangible. We have, to my left over here, a table with communion on it if you'd like to partake in that. As you ready your heart for a new year, as you ready your heart for this journey that we're going to take, following the way of Jesus, walking with him to Easter. And then for this Sunday, for this week, but then throughout this teaching series, you'll notice to my right in the back corner of the room, there's a frame with Sharpies and a can. And it can be during this response time. It can be after the service. It can be any time during this series. I'm wondering if you might know someone who might be compelled towards Jesus. And if you do, wouldn't it be something to put their name over there, to begin praying, to invite? Wouldn't it be something if on Easter, if at resurrection, someone finds their name in those borders, and they've been brought into a new way of life because of your prayers, and they can see that it was prayed long before you invited them. So if someone is put on your heart, maybe consider writing their name over there this morning. It's a variety of ways to respond. Each of them we leave up to you. You can pray from your seat. There's cards on the back of the chair in front of you. It's another way to respond to. If there's something we can pray for you about, you can fill that out and drop it in the box on your way out. There's lots of different ways to take inventory of what the Lord might be saying to you. So Jesus, thank you for not leaving us down here with the lights out to blindly grope our way back to you. I think so often we get so used to begging for people to follow you that we forget what a blessing it is to even be invited. You didn't have to turn the lights back on. So Jesus, as we attempt to follow you as the way and the truth and the life, we pray that you prepare our hearts, that this journey we take with you through the Gospel of John to Easter would be a powerful one, that it would be personal. And Lord, in this moment, if there's folks that we know would we invite them into that journey too? So Holy Spirit, speak in this time. Speak to our hearts. Speak of the grace and the truth of the Son of God.
Thank you again for joining us online. We hope you enjoyed the message. To connect with us, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. For more information on who we are, check out our website, midtownvineyardchurch.com. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you leave us a review or drop us a comment. Until next time, have a great day.